remember the day my life divided into before and after, though at the time I did not yet understand what had been taken from me. The morning had begun like so many others, wrapped in quiet routine, where the small, ordinary moments felt permanent and safe. The light crept through the window in a soft, golden way, touching the walls as if nothing in the world could ever go wrong. I moved through the house with the same gentle rhythm, unaware that every step was leading me toward an emptiness that would never be filled. There is something cruel about how loss announces itself. It does not arrive with warning bells or shadows creeping along the walls. It comes disguised in normalcy, in the familiar sound of a door closing, in the last shared glance that seems no different from all the others. That morning, I did not cling tightly enough. I did not hold onto the fleeting seconds that would later replay endlessly in my mind. I did not know that those ordinary moments were the last threads of a life that would soon unravel. When the news came, it did not feel real. It was as if someone had spoken words in a language I could not understand, yet somehow I knew their meaning deep inside my bones. My body reacted before my mind could grasp it. The world around me shifted, as though the ground itself had lost its balance. I remember staring at nothing, hearing everything and nothing all at once, feeling as though I had been pulled out of my own life and dropped into a hollow space where time no longer moved the same way. Grief does not arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, like water through cracks, filling every corner of your existence until there is no dry place left to stand. In those first hours, I was suspended between disbelief and terror. I kept waiting for someone to correct the mistake, to say that there had been confusion, that everything was as it should be. But no such words came. Silence became the loudest sound I had ever known. The house, once full of warmth, began to feel unfamiliar. Every object carried a memory, and every memory carried a weight I could not bear. The chair by the window, the cup left on the table, the quiet echo of footsteps that would never return, all of it pressed against me, reminding me of what had been and what would never be again. I found myself moving carefully, as if even the smallest disturbance might shatter what little remained of my world. People came and went, their voices soft, their faces heavy with sympathy. They spoke words meant to comfort, but their meanings slipped past me. I nodded when I was expected to nod, listened when I was expected to listen, but inside there was only a vast emptiness. It was not just the absence of someone, it was the absence of everything that had once given my life direction and meaning. Nights became the hardest part. Darkness has a way of amplifying sorrow, of stretching it until it feels endless. I would lie awake, staring into the void, replaying memories over and over again, searching for something I could have changed. Regret became a constant companion, whispering questions that had no answers. What if I had said more? What if I had noticed something I had missed? What if I had held on just a little longer? Sleep, when it came, was not a refuge but a reminder. Dreams would carry me back to moments that felt so real, so alive, only to dissolve the instant I woke. That cruel transition, from the illusion of presence to the reality of absence, became a daily wound that refused to heal. Each morning, I had to learn the truth all over again, as if my heart had not yet accepted what my mind already knew. Days turned into a blur of quiet suffering. Time lost its structure, its purpose. I no longer measured it in hours or moments, but in waves of pain that rose and fell without warning. Sometimes, I would find myself standing still for long periods, unsure of what I had been doing or what I was supposed to do next. The simplest tasks felt overwhelming, as if they belonged to a life that no longer existed. There is a loneliness in widowhood that cannot be explained, only felt. It is not just the absence of companionship. It is the absence of being understood without words. It is the silence where laughter once lived, the stillness where there was once movement. It is the realization that the person who knew you in a way no one else ever could is gone, leaving behind a version of yourself that feels incomplete and unfamiliar. People often think grief fades with time, but they do not understand that it changes shape rather than disappearing. In those early days, it was sharp and overwhelming, like a storm that refused to pass. Every memory was a blade, every thought a reminder of what had been lost. I wondered how something invisible could carry so much weight, how a single absence could alter the entire course of a life. I began to notice the small ways in which the world continued, indifferent to my pain. The sun still rose each morning, the streets remained busy, Voices filled the air with conversations that had nothing to do with loss. It felt almost offensive, as though the world had moved on too quickly, leaving me behind in a place where time had stopped. I wanted everything to pause, to acknowledge the magnitude of what had been taken, but nothing did. There were moments when I tried to hold on to strength, when I told myself that I had to endure, that I had no other choice. But strength felt like a distant concept, something that belonged to another version of me. The person I had been before no longer existed, and I did not yet know who I was becoming. All I knew was that I had been changed in a way that could never be undone. Memories became both a comfort and a curse. I clung to them because they were all I had left, yet they also reminded me of everything I had lost. I found myself revisiting the past again and again, searching for moments I had overlooked, words I had not fully appreciated. It was as if I was trying to gather pieces of something that could never be made whole again. In quiet moments, I would sit and listen, almost expecting to hear familiar sounds. A voice calling out, footsteps approaching, the subtle signs of a presence that was no longer there. The silence that followed was always the same, heavy and unyielding. It was in those moments that the reality of my situation felt the most unbearable. The journey of becoming a widow is not marked by a single event, but by a series of realizations that unfold over time. At first, it is the shock, the disbelief. Then comes the understanding, slow and painful, that life as it once was will never return. Each day brings a new layer of acceptance, but also a new depth of sorrow. I did not know then how long this path would be or how deeply it would shape me. I only knew that I was standing at the beginning of something I had never chosen, something I could not escape. And as I looked ahead into the uncertain future, all I could feel was the weight of a life that had been broken, and the quiet, persistent ache of a heart learning to live with absence. In the days that followed, I began to understand that loss does not remain still. It moves, it shifts, it finds new ways to make itself known. What had first arrived as shock slowly transformed into something heavier, something more permanent. The numbness that had wrapped around me like a shield began to thin, and beneath it, the pain grew sharper, more defined. It was no longer distant or unreal. It was present, constant, and deeply rooted within me. Mornings became a quiet battle. Waking up meant facing the same truth again, and each time it felt just as unbearable as the first. There was always a brief moment, just a few seconds, where I would forget. In that fragile space between sleep and awareness, everything still felt as it once had been. But then reality would settle in, heavy and unforgiving, and the weight of it would press down on me until I could hardly breathe. I began to avoid certain places within the house. There were corners that held too many memories, objects that seemed to carry echoes of a life I could no longer reach. A simple glance at something familiar could unravel me completely. It was as if everything had been left behind exactly as it was, frozen in time, while I was forced to move forward alone. There is a strange kind of emptiness that follows loss, one that cannot be filled by anything else. People tried to be kind, to offer support in ways they understood, but there are some spaces that no one else can enter. There were moments when I wanted to speak, to express the depth of what I was feeling, but words always seemed too small, too inadequate. How could I explain a pain that had no clear shape, no boundaries? I found myself replaying the final days over and over again. Every detail became significant, every moment something to be examined. I searched for signs, for something I might have missed, something that could have changed the outcome. Regret settled into my thoughts, persistent and unrelenting. It asked questions that had no answers, yet it refused to be silenced. Sometimes I would sit for hours, lost in memories that felt both vivid and distant. I could recall the smallest details, the way the light fell across the room, the sound of laughter, the quiet comfort of shared silence. These memories were all I had left, yet they felt like fragments of a dream I could no longer return to. The more I held onto them, the more I realized how much had been taken from me. The world outside continued its rhythm, unchanged and indifferent. I would watch people go about their lives, engaged in conversations, making plans, laughing as though nothing had shifted. It felt like I was observing a different reality, one I no longer belonged to. There was a distance between me and everything else, an invisible barrier that I could not cross. Grief began to show itself in unexpected ways. It was not always loud or overwhelming. Sometimes it was quiet, almost subtle, creeping in through the smallest moments. A familiar scent, a passing thought, a sudden silence where there should have been sound. These were the things that caught me off guard. They would appear without warning, and in an instant I would feel the full weight of what I had lost. Nights remained the most difficult. Darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, giving space for thoughts to wander where they should not. I would lie awake, my mind circling the same questions, the same memories, unable to find rest. Sleep became something I both longed for and feared, because it brought with it dreams that felt too real to bear. There were moments when I tried to convince myself that I had to be strong, that I had to continue, but strength felt like something distant, something I could not quite reach. Every step forward felt uncertain, as though I was moving through a life that no longer fit me. The person I had been before felt like a stranger, someone I could barely recognize. I began to notice how grief changes the way time is experienced. Days felt long and heavy, yet somehow they passed without leaving any clear memory behind. It was as if I was existing in a continuous moment of loss, where past and present blended together in a way that made it impossible to separate them. The future, once something I had thought about with hope, now felt uncertain and distant. There is a particular kind of silence that comes with widowhood. It is not just the absence of sound, but the absence of presence. It is the quiet that follows a conversation that will never happen again, the stillness of a space that once held warmth. That silence became a constant companion, filling the spaces where life had once existed. I struggled with the idea of moving forward. It felt wrong, almost like a betrayal, to continue living as though nothing had happened. Yet at the same time, I knew that staying still would not change anything. This conflict became a quiet tension within me, pulling me in opposite directions. I did not know how to honor what had been while also accepting what was. People often speak of healing as though it is a clear path, something that can be followed step by step. But what I was experiencing did not feel like healing. It felt like learning to exist with a wound that would never fully close. Each day brought a new understanding, a new realization of how deeply loss had altered me. There were moments when I felt a kind of exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. It was a weariness that settled into my bones, making even the simplest things feel overwhelming. Getting through the day became an achievement in itself, something that required more effort than I had ever imagined. Yet, even in the midst of all this, there were small moments, brief and fleeting, where I felt something other than pain. A quiet memory that brought a hint of warmth, a gentle reminder of what had once been. These moments did not erase the sorrow, but they softened it, if only for a short while. I began to understand that grief is not something to be overcome, but something to be carried. It becomes a part of you, woven into your thoughts, your actions, your very way of being. And while the weight of it may shift over time, it never truly disappears. As I moved through those days, still uncertain, still searching for something to hold on to, I realized that I was no longer the same person who had once moved through life with ease. I had been changed in ways I could not yet fully understand. And though I did not know what lay ahead, I knew that this journey, this quiet, painful transformation, had only just begun. As time moved forward, I began to realize that grief does not follow any order. It does not come in stages that can be predicted or controlled. Instead, it arrives in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes overwhelming, and each wave carries with it a different kind of pain. Just when I thought I had learned how to endure one form of sorrow, another would rise, unexpected and unrelenting. There were days when anger found its way into my heart, quiet at first, then growing stronger. It was not directed at anything specific, yet it felt deeply rooted. I questioned everything: the fairness of life, the randomness of loss, the silence that followed my unanswered pleas. Why had everything been taken away so suddenly? Why had I been left behind to carry the weight of what remained? These questions circled endlessly, with no answers to soothe them. Alongside anger came guilt, a heavy and persistent presence that refused to leave. I began to examine every memory more closely, searching for moments where I could have done something differently. I thought about the times I had been distracted, the words I had not said, the gestures I had assumed could wait for another day. Regret became a quiet voice within me, reminding me that there were things left unfinished, things that would now remain that way forever. I often found myself caught between holding on and letting go. Memories were all I had, yet they also kept me anchored in a past I could not return to. There were moments when I tried to avoid thinking about them, to push them aside in an effort to protect myself from the pain. But the more I resisted, the stronger they seemed to become, as though they were determined not to be forgotten. The house no longer felt like a place of comfort. It had become a space filled with echoes, each room carrying a different reminder of what had once been. Even the smallest details, the way things were arranged, the familiar patterns of daily life, felt altered. It was as if everything had shifted slightly out of place, leaving behind a sense of imbalance that I could not correct. I began to notice how grief affected my sense of identity. I was no longer who I had been before, yet I did not know who I was now. The role I had once lived within had been taken from me, leaving behind a version of myself that felt incomplete. I struggled to understand how to move through the world when so much of what had defined me was gone. There were moments when I withdrew from everything around me. Conversations felt distant, as though they were happening somewhere far away. I found it difficult to connect with others, not because I did not want to, but because I felt separated by something I could not explain. There was a depth to my pain that words could not capture, and without those words, I remained isolated within my own thoughts. Sometimes I would observe others and wonder how they managed to carry on so easily. Their lives seemed untouched, unchanged, while mine had been completely transformed. It was not that I wished for their sorrow, but there was a quiet sense of disconnection, as though I was no longer part of the same world. There were also moments of unexpected emotion, sudden and intense. A simple memory, a passing thought, even a quiet silence could trigger a wave of sadness so strong that it felt impossible to contain. These moments would come without warning, breaking through whatever sense of calm I had managed to build. And when they passed, they left behind a deeper sense of emptiness. I began to understand that grief is not just about loss, it is also about adjustment. It is about learning how to exist in a world that no longer feels familiar. Every day required a kind of effort I had never known before. Even the smallest decisions felt significant, as though I was navigating a life without a clear direction. There were times when I felt a deep sense of longing, not just for what had been, but for what could have been. The future I had once imagined had disappeared, leaving behind a space filled with uncertainty. I found myself thinking about all the moments that would never happen, all the experiences that would remain unrealized. This sense of loss extended beyond the past. It reached into the future, reshaping everything I had once hoped for. In quiet moments, I would sit with my thoughts, allowing them to come and go without resistance. It was not always easy, but I began to realize that avoiding the pain only made it stronger. By facing it, even in small ways, I could begin to understand it. I could begin to see how it was changing me, shaping me into someone I did not yet fully recognize. There were days when I felt a small sense of clarity, a brief understanding that life, despite everything, continued. These moments were fragile, easily overshadowed by the weight of grief, but they were there nonetheless. They reminded me that even in the midst of sorrow, there was still movement, still a quiet progression forward. Yet acceptance felt distant, almost unreachable. I knew what had happened, I understood it on a logical level, but my heart had not yet caught up. There was still a part of me that resisted, that held on to the hope that somehow, something might change. Letting go of that hope felt like letting go of everything. As I continued to move through this unfamiliar path, I realized that there was no clear destination. There was no point at which everything would suddenly make sense or feel whole again. Instead, there was only this ongoing process, this slow, painful adaptation to a reality I had never chosen. And so I continued, step by step, carrying the weight of what had been lost, learning in small, uncertain ways how to live within the silence that remained. As the days slowly turned into weeks, I began to notice a different kind of pain emerging, one that was quieter but somehow deeper. The sharpness of the early grief had not disappeared, but it had settled into something more constant, more woven into my everyday existence. It was no longer only in sudden waves. It was present in the background of everything, like a shadow that never left. There was a heaviness in continuing life. Each day carried an unspoken question. How does one keep going when something essential is missing? I found myself moving through routines that no longer felt meaningful. The actions were the same, waking, walking, sitting, eating, but the purpose behind them had faded. It felt as though I was performing a life rather than living it. I began to understand that loneliness is not simply about being alone. It is about the absence of a specific presence, a particular kind of understanding that cannot be replaced. Even in the company of others, there was a distance I could not close. Conversations passed around me, words spoken and heard, yet none of them reached the place within me that had been left empty. There were moments when I would almost forget, not entirely, but just enough to feel a slight sense of normalcy. A brief distraction, a passing thought, something that momentarily pulled me away from the weight of loss. But these moments never lasted. The realization would return, often more forcefully, as if reminding me that there was no escaping it. I started to notice how deeply connected memories were to the simplest things. A familiar sound could bring everything rushing back. The way light entered a room at a certain time of day, the quiet stillness of an evening, even the absence of something that used to be there. Each of these became a trigger, pulling me back into a past that felt both close and unreachable. There was a growing sense of disorientation within me. The life I had once known felt like a different world, one that I could remember clearly but could no longer touch. And the life I was now living did not yet feel real. I existed somewhere in between, caught in a space where nothing felt fully grounded. I also began to feel the weight of expectations, both from others and from within myself. There is an unspoken belief that time should bring healing, that gradually things should improve, that eventually one should return to some version of normal. But what is normal after such a loss? The idea itself felt distant, almost impossible. There were times when I tried to appear unchanged, to move through the world in a way that did not reveal the depth of what I was carrying. But it was exhausting. Grief does not remain hidden. It finds ways to surface, no matter how much one tries to contain it. A sudden silence, a lingering thought, a moment of stillness, these were enough to expose everything. I found myself questioning not just the past, but the meaning of everything around me. What once felt certain now seemed fragile. The idea that life could change so completely in a single moment made everything feel uncertain. There was no longer a sense of stability, no guarantee that anything would remain as it was. There were also moments of unexpected reflection. I began to think about the nature of attachment, of how deeply we connect to others, and how those connections shape who we are. Losing such a connection felt like losing a part of myself, a part that could never be replaced. It made me realize how much of my identity had been intertwined with someone else. In quiet hours, I would sit and allow my thoughts to unfold without resistance. Sometimes they brought pain, sometimes confusion, and sometimes a strange kind of calm. Not peace, but a temporary stillness, as if everything had paused for just a moment. These moments were rare, but they gave me a glimpse of something beyond the constant weight of sorrow. I began to understand that grief is not only about remembering, it is also about adjusting. It is about learning to carry memories without being completely consumed by them. This understanding did not come easily, and I was far from achieving it, but it began to take shape in small, subtle ways. There were days when I felt an overwhelming sense of fatigue, not just physically, but emotionally. The effort of processing everything, of continuing forward despite the pain, was draining in a way I had never experienced before. Even the act of thinking felt heavy, as though my mind itself was burdened by the weight of loss. At times, I would wonder if this feeling would ever change, if there would come a day when the pain would lessen, when the absence would not feel so overwhelming. But these thoughts often led nowhere, circling back to the same uncertainty. There were no clear answers, only the ongoing experience of moving through something I did not fully understand. Yet even within this uncertainty, there was a quiet realization forming. Life, despite everything, had not stopped. It had changed, profoundly and irreversibly, but it continued. And within that continuation, there was a need, however small, however difficult, to find a way to exist within it. I did not yet know what that would look like. I did not know how to rebuild a sense of meaning or direction. But somewhere beneath the layers of grief, there was a faint awareness that this journey, as painful as it was shaping something within me. And so I continued, not because I had found strength, but because there was no other choice. Step by step, moment by moment, learning to live with the absence, learning to carry the silence, and slowly beginning to understand that grief, in all its depth and complexity, was now a part of who I was. With time, I began to notice that grief was no longer only something I felt. It had become something I lived inside. It shaped my thoughts before they fully formed, influenced my actions before I understood them, and colored every moment with a quiet, lingering heaviness. It was no longer separate from me. It had settled into my existence as something constant, something that would not leave. There was a different kind of realization that began to grow within me, the understanding of permanence. In the beginning, there had always been a small, fragile part of me that held onto disbelief, that resisted the finality of what had happened. But as days turned into weeks, that resistance weakened. The truth became clearer, heavier, and more undeniable. What had been lost was not returning. This realization did not come all at once. It arrived in fragments, in moments that seemed ordinary but carried deep meaning. It was in the empty spaces that remained unchanged, in the routines that no longer made sense, in the absence that could not be ignored. Each of these moments added to the quiet understanding that this was not temporary. This was the new reality. There was a deep sadness in accepting that life does not pause for grief. The world continued to move, to change, to evolve, while I felt as though I was standing still. People adapted, adjusted, and carried on, but I struggled to find that same movement within myself. It felt as though I had been left behind, existing in a space where time had slowed, where everything was heavier. I began to feel the distance between myself and others more clearly. It was not something they created, but something that had formed within me. There was a gap between what I was experiencing and what could be understood from the outside. Even when others tried to offer comfort, there was a limit to how much they could reach. Some parts of grief are deeply personal, beyond explanation, beyond sharing. There were moments when I longed for silence, and others when silence felt unbearable. It was a strange contradiction. When surrounded by noise, I felt disconnected, unable to fully engage. But when alone, the quiet would amplify every thought, every memory, every feeling I had been trying to hold back. There was no perfect place, no environment that could fully ease what I was carrying. I started to notice how much of life is built on shared experiences, on the presence of someone who witnesses moments alongside you. Without that, even simple things felt incomplete. A thought left unspoken, a moment left unshared, a feeling that had nowhere to go. These became small but constant reminders of what was missing. There was also a growing awareness of the future, not as something hopeful, but as something uncertain. The plans that had once existed no longer held meaning. The direction I had once known had disappeared, leaving behind a path that felt unclear and unfamiliar. I found myself questioning not just what would come next, but how I would face it. At times, I tried to imagine a version of myself that had adjusted, that had learned to live with this loss in a way that felt manageable. But that version felt distant, almost unreal. It was difficult to picture a life where this pain was not at the center of everything. It was difficult to believe that something so profound could ever become less consuming. Memories continued to be both a source of comfort and a cause of pain. There were moments when they brought a sense of closeness, a reminder of what had once been real and full of life. But there were also times when they felt overwhelming, when the contrast between past and present became too great to bear. It was a delicate balance, one that I had not yet learned how to manage. I began to understand that grief changes the way one sees the world. Things that once seemed important lost their significance, while small, previously unnoticed details took on new meaning. There was a shift in perspective, a quiet reevaluation of what truly mattered. But even this understanding came with its own weight, its own sense of loss for what had been. There were days when I felt an almost physical ache, as though the absence had taken form within me. It was not something that could be seen, but it was deeply felt. It made everything slower, heavier, more difficult to carry. Even breathing sometimes felt like an effort, as though the air itself had become dense with sorrow. Yet within all of this, there were moments, brief and fragile, where something else appeared. Not happiness, not even peace, but a slight easing of the weight. A quiet moment where the pain was not as sharp, where the absence did not feel as overwhelming. These moments were small, almost insignificant, but they were there. I did not know what they meant at first. I did not know if they were a sign of something changing, or simply a temporary pause in the constant presence of grief. But I noticed them, held on to them in a way that felt cautious, as though they might disappear if I paid too much attention. There was also a growing realization that I could not remain exactly as I was in the beginning. Something within me was shifting, slowly and quietly. It was not a return to who I had been, but the formation of something new. This change was not something I chose, nor something I fully understood, but it was happening nonetheless. I began to see that grief is not a single emotion, but a collection of many: sadness, anger, confusion, longing, and even moments of unexpected calm. They did not come in order, nor did they follow any pattern. They simply existed, moving through me in ways that I could not control. There were times when I resisted this change, when I wanted to hold onto the intensity of the early grief, as though letting it soften would mean letting go of what had been lost. But deep down, I knew that holding on to pain would not bring anything back. It would only keep me trapped in a place where nothing could grow. As I continued to move forward, even in small, uncertain steps, I began to understand that this journey was not about forgetting or moving on. It was about learning how to carry what had been lost in a way that allowed me to continue existing. I was still far from understanding how to do that. I was still learning, still struggling, still finding my way through something that had no clear direction. But somewhere within all of this, there was a quiet awareness that I was changing, not away from the past, but because of it. And so I continued, holding onto what I could, letting go of what I could not, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to find a way to exist within a life that had been forever altered. As the weeks turned into months, I began to realize that grief was no longer something that arrived in sudden waves. It had become the air I breathed. It surrounded every moment, even the quiet ones that once felt safe. There was no escaping it, no stepping outside of it. It was woven into my thoughts, my movements, even the pauses between my breaths. There was a subtle shift happening within me, one I did not fully notice at first. The sharp edges of the early pain had softened slightly, but in their place was something deeper, something more enduring. It was not easier, just different. The sorrow had settled into a steady presence, like a quiet ache that never truly faded. I began to notice how much silence had become a part of my life. Not just the absence of sound, but a deeper kind of silence. The absence of shared moments, of unspoken understanding, of a presence that once filled the spaces around me. Even when there was noise, it felt distant, as though it belonged to a world I was no longer fully part of. There were times when I would find myself reaching for something that was no longer there. A thought would come, a moment would happen, and instinctively I would turn, as if expecting to share it. And then I would remember. That quiet realization, repeated over and over again, never became easier. It was a small but constant reminder of the absence that had reshaped everything. I started to feel a strange relationship with time. It no longer moved in a way that made sense. Some days felt endlessly long, stretching out in a way that made every moment heavy. Other days passed quickly, slipping by without leaving any clear memory behind. It was as if time itself had lost its structure, becoming something unpredictable and uneven. There were moments when I felt detached from my own life, as though I was watching it from a distance. I would go through the motions, complete the necessary tasks, respond when spoken to, but inside there was a sense of separation. It was not that I was unaware, it was that everything felt slightly out of reach, as though I could not fully connect to the present. I also began to notice how grief changed my understanding of others. I saw things I had not seen before, the hidden struggles, the quiet sadness in places where I had once overlooked it. It was as if experiencing such a deep loss had opened a part of me that recognized pain in different forms. Yet, even with this awareness, I still felt alone in my own experience. There were days when memories came more gently, not as sharp reminders, but as quiet reflections. I could think of moments from the past without feeling completely overwhelmed. These instances were rare, but they were significant. They showed me that something within me was shifting, even if I did not fully understand how or why. But there were also days when the grief returned with full force, as though no time had passed at all. On those days, everything felt just as raw, just as unbearable as in the beginning. It was confusing, this lack of consistency. Just when I thought I had found some balance, it would be disrupted, and I would be pulled back into the depths of sorrow. I began to understand that healing, if it could be called that, was not a straight path. It moved in circles, in patterns that repeated and changed. There was no clear progress, no moment where I could say I had moved beyond the pain. There was only this ongoing process of adjusting, of learning to exist within something that would always be a part of me. There was also a quiet fear that began to take shape, the fear of forgetting. Not the major memories, but the small details. The sound of a voice, the way certain moments felt, the little things that made everything unique. I held onto these details tightly, afraid that with time, they might fade, leaving behind only fragments. At the same time, there was another fear, the fear of never moving forward. Of remaining in this place, where the past held more weight than the present, where the future felt uncertain and distant. This tension between holding on and letting go became a constant presence, something I carried with me every day. I started to notice how grief changes the way one experiences even the simplest things. A quiet evening, once comforting, could now feel overwhelming. A moment of laughter, if it came at all, could be followed by guilt, as though I was forgetting something important. There was a complexity to every emotion, a layering that had not existed before. There were times when I questioned whether I was doing something wrong, whether I should be feeling differently, coping better, moving forward more quickly. But these thoughts never led to any clear answers. Grief did not follow rules, and it did not respond to expectations. It simply existed, in its own way, at its own pace. Yet within all of this, there was a quiet resilience forming, not something strong or obvious, but something subtle. It was in the way I continued, even when I did not feel capable. It was in the small acts of getting through the day, of facing each moment as it came. It was not strength in the way I had once understood it, but it was something. I began to realize that continuing did not mean leaving anything behind. It did not mean forgetting or diminishing what had been lost. It simply meant allowing life to move, even with the weight of grief still present. This understanding was not comforting, but it was grounding in a way I had not expected. There were still many moments of uncertainty, many questions without answers, many feelings I could not fully explain. But there was also a growing awareness that this experience, as painful as it was shaping me in ways I could not yet fully see. And so I continued, not with certainty or clarity, but with a quiet persistence. Each day was still a challenge, still filled with moments of heaviness and reflection. But within that, there was also a slow, almost imperceptible movement forward, a continuation of life, even in the presence of loss. I did not know where this path would lead or what I would become as I walked it, but I knew that I was still here, still moving, still learning how to carry what could never be set down. As more time passed, I began to notice that grief had become quieter on the surface, but deeper within. It no longer always demanded my full attention with overwhelming force, yet it remained present in everything I did. It had settled into the rhythm of my life, not as something separate, but as something that existed alongside every thought, every action, every breath. There was a strange realization that came with this stage. The world no longer felt paused, yet I still felt out of step with it. People continued to move forward, their lives unfolding in ways that seemed natural and expected. Meanwhile, I carried a sense of hesitation within me, as though every step required careful thought, as though I was walking through something fragile that could break at any moment. I began to notice how much had changed within me, not just in how I felt, but in how I saw everything around me. Things that once felt important no longer held the same weight. Small concerns that used to occupy my mind seemed distant, almost insignificant. In their place was a deeper awareness of how quickly everything can change, how nothing is ever truly guaranteed. There was also a quiet distance forming between me and the person I had once been. I could remember that version of myself clearly, the ease, the sense of certainty, the way life once felt stable and predictable. But that version no longer felt like me. It was as though I had stepped into a different existence, one shaped by loss and everything that followed it. At times, I found myself reflecting on the idea of identity. Who was I now in the absence of what had once defined me? The roles I had lived within, the expectations I had carried, the future I had imagined, all of these had been altered. I was still myself, yet I was also someone entirely changed. This realization was both unsettling and quietly profound. There were moments when I felt a kind of emptiness that was difficult to describe. It was not always painful, but it was deeply noticeable. It was the absence of something that had once filled my life completely, leaving behind a space that could not be replaced. I learned to sit with this emptiness, to acknowledge it without trying to force it away. Sometimes, I would find myself in places or situations that once felt familiar, only to realize that they no longer felt the same. The context had changed, even if the surroundings had not. Memories lingered in those spaces, creating a contrast between what was and what had been. It was a quiet reminder that even the most ordinary places can hold extraordinary meaning. I also began to notice a subtle shift in how I approached each day. In the beginning, everything had felt overwhelming, impossible to manage. But now, there was a slow adjustment taking place. I was not free from grief, but I was learning how to move within it. Small routines began to take shape again, not as they once were, but in new forms that fit the life I was now living. There were still difficult moments, times when the grief would rise unexpectedly, catching me off guard. A memory, a thought, a simple reminder could bring everything rushing back with full intensity. In those moments, it felt as though no time had passed at all. The pain was just as real, just as immediate as it had been in the beginning. But there were also moments when I could observe my grief from a slight distance, as though I had gained a small amount of space within it. I could feel it without being completely consumed by it. These moments were not frequent, but they were significant. They showed me that something within me was adapting, finding ways to hold the pain without being entirely overwhelmed. I began to understand that grief does not disappear, it changes. It becomes something that can exist alongside other emotions, rather than replacing them entirely. There were brief instances where I could feel something else, a quiet calm, a moment of reflection, even a faint sense of appreciation for something small. These feelings did not erase the grief, but they existed with it. There was also a growing awareness of resilience, though it did not feel like strength in the traditional sense. It was not about overcoming or conquering anything. It was about continuing, about finding a way to exist within a reality that had been permanently altered. It was quiet, subtle, and often unnoticed, but it was there. I started to reflect on the idea of meaning, something I had not been able to consider in the earlier stages of my grief. I did not have answers, and I was not searching for explanations, but I began to wonder how this experience would shape the rest of my life. What would I carry forward? What would change in how I lived, how I saw the world? There were moments when I felt a sense of connection to something deeper, not to replace what had been lost, but to acknowledge its impact. The memories, the experiences, the shared moments, all of these had become part of me in a different way. They were no longer something I could live within, but something I carried with me. At times, I still struggled with the idea of moving forward. There was a lingering feeling that doing so might mean leaving something behind. But slowly, I began to understand that moving forward did not mean forgetting. It did not mean diminishing what had been. It simply meant allowing life to continue, even with the presence of loss. There were still many uncertainties, many questions without clear answers. But there was also a gradual shift from surviving each moment to beginning to live within them again, even if that life looked very different from before. I continued to move carefully, aware of the weight I carried, but also aware that I was still moving. Each step, no matter how small, was a continuation, a quiet acknowledgement that despite everything, life had not stopped entirely. And in that slow, uncertain movement, I began to see that while grief would always be a part of me, it did not have to be the only part. There came a time when the silence no longer felt unfamiliar. It became something I understood too well. It settled around me like a constant presence, no longer shocking, no longer unexpected, but deeply woven into the rhythm of my life. I had learned how to sit within it, how to move through it, but that did not mean it had become any less heavy. What changed was not the absence, but my awareness of it. In the beginning, it had felt like a sudden emptiness, a space that should not exist. Now it felt like something that had always been there, something I had simply learned to recognize. It was no longer a break in my life, it had become part of its structure. I began to notice that my thoughts were no longer always centered on the moment of loss itself. Instead, they had expanded into something broader. I found myself thinking about everything that had led up to it, everything that had followed it, and everything that existed in between. Grief was no longer tied to a single point in time. It had stretched across my entire sense of past, present, and future. There were moments when I would pause and reflect on how much had changed, not just externally, but internally. The way I thought, the way I felt, the way I responded to the world, all of it had shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. I had become more aware of things I once overlooked, more sensitive to moments that might have once passed unnoticed. At the same time, there was a quiet sense of detachment that had settled within me. Not a complete disconnection, but a slight distance between myself and everything around me. It was as if I had learned to protect a part of myself, to keep it separate from the world in a way that felt necessary. There were still moments of deep sadness, moments when everything felt just as overwhelming as it had in the beginning. These moments did not come as often, but when they did, they carried the same weight, the same intensity. It was a reminder that grief does not fade in a straight line. It moves in patterns, returning when least expected. But alongside that sadness, there were also moments of quiet acceptance. Not acceptance in the sense of approval or peace, but in the sense of acknowledgement. A recognition that this was my reality, that this was something I had to carry. These moments did not erase the pain, but they allowed me to sit with it without resistance. I began to understand that holding onto memories did not have to mean holding onto pain in the same way. There were ways to remember without being completely undone. It was not easy, and it did not happen all at once, but slowly, I started to see that memories could exist in different forms, not just as reminders of loss, but as reflections of something that had once been real and meaningful. There were times when I would find myself remembering small details, things that might have once seemed insignificant. A particular way of speaking, a quiet habit, a shared moment that had no grand importance at the time. These details began to feel precious, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were part of something that could never be recreated. I also began to notice how my relationship with the future was changing. In the beginning, it had felt distant, uncertain, almost impossible to imagine. Now it was still unclear, but not entirely unreachable. There were moments when I could think ahead, even if only slightly, without feeling completely overwhelmed. This did not mean that I had found direction or clarity. It simply meant that the idea of continuing no longer felt as impossible as it once had. There was a small shift, a quiet opening, where the future existed not as something threatening, but as something unknown. There were still fears, still uncertainties, still moments when the weight of everything felt too much to carry. But there was also a growing understanding that I had already carried so much, that I had already moved through something I once thought I could not survive. I began to see that strength is not always something visible. It does not always appear as confidence or certainty. Sometimes it is simply the act of continuing, of waking up each day and facing what comes, even when it feels difficult. It is quiet, often unnoticed, but deeply present. There were moments when I questioned whether I was truly moving forward, or simply learning how to exist within the same place. But perhaps there was no clear distinction between the two. Perhaps moving forward was not about leaving anything behind, but about finding new ways to carry it. I also started to feel a subtle shift in how I connected with the world. While there was still a distance, there were also moments of awareness, moments where I could engage with something outside of myself without being completely pulled back into grief. These moments were small, but they mattered. I realized that life, even in its altered form, still contained moments, small, quiet, fleeting moments that existed independently of loss. They did not replace what had been lost, nor did they diminish its significance, but they existed nonetheless. And in recognizing those moments, I began to understand something that I had not been able to see before, that even within a life shaped by absence, there can still be presence. Not in the way it once was, not in the way I might wish it to be, but in a different, quieter form. I was still carrying everything. The memories, the absence, the questions, the changes, all of it remained. But I was also beginning, slowly and uncertainly, to carry something else alongside it. The possibility of continuing, not in spite of what had happened, but with it. And so I remained in that space, not fully healed, not fully at peace, but no longer entirely lost. A place where grief and life existed together, where the past was not forgotten, and the future, though unclear, was no longer completely unreachable. There came a point where I began to realize that grief was no longer the only thing guiding my days, yet it had not left me either. It existed beside everything else, quieter at times, louder at others, but always present. It had become something I carried without thinking, like a weight I had grown used to, even though I never truly accepted it. I started to notice that my days were no longer entirely defined by sorrow. There were moments, small, almost unnoticeable at first, where something else appeared. A thought that was not tied to loss, a brief pause that did not feel heavy, a quiet second where my mind rested. These moments did not last long, but they were different, and I became aware of them. At first, this awareness felt strange, almost unsettling. There was a part of me that questioned it, that wondered if allowing these lighter moments meant I was forgetting, or worse, leaving something behind. The idea of feeling anything other than grief carried a quiet sense of guilt, as though I was stepping away from something I was supposed to hold on to. But grief does not demand constant suffering to prove its depth. This was something I was only beginning to understand. The presence of other emotions did not erase what had been lost. It did not diminish the significance of anything. It simply meant that life, even in its altered state, was still moving. There were moments when I found myself observing the world again, not as something distant, but as something I was still a part of, even if only slightly. The sounds, the movements, the passing of time, these things no longer felt entirely separate from me. I could sit within them without feeling completely disconnected. And yet the absence remained. It did not fade or become less real. It simply existed in a different way. It was no longer always at the front of my mind, but it was never far. It lived in the quiet spaces, in the pauses between thoughts, in the moments where something felt incomplete. I began to understand that grief is not something that disappears. It becomes something that changes shape over time. It integrates into life, rather than standing apart from it. This realization did not bring comfort, but it brought a kind of clarity. It helped me see that what I was experiencing was not a failure to move on, but a natural continuation of something that had deeply changed me. There were still days when everything felt heavy again, when the weight returned with full force, reminding me of how everything had once felt. On those days, it was as though no time had passed at all. The pain was immediate, raw, and deeply familiar. These moments could not be predicted or controlled. They simply arrived, and I had to face them as they were. But there were also days when I could move through time without feeling completely overwhelmed. I could complete simple tasks, follow small routines, exist within moments without constantly being pulled back into the past. These days felt fragile, as though they could shift at any moment, but they were real. I noticed that my thoughts about the future were beginning to change, slowly and carefully. In the beginning, the future had felt empty, almost impossible to imagine. Now it still felt uncertain, but not entirely unreachable. I could think ahead in small ways, consider possibilities without feeling completely lost. This did not mean that I had found direction or purpose. It simply meant that I was beginning to accept that there was still a path ahead, even if I could not see it clearly. There was something beyond the present moment, something that had yet to unfold. There was also a growing understanding within me about what it meant to carry loss. It was not about holding on to pain in a way that consumed everything. It was about allowing the memory, the experience, the connection to exist without needing to relive it constantly. This was not something I had mastered, but it was something I was beginning to see. I started to feel a subtle shift in how I held my memories. They were still powerful, still deeply emotional, but they were not always overwhelming. There were moments when I could think of the past with a quiet sense of reflection rather than immediate sorrow. These moments were rare, but they marked a change. There was also a deeper awareness of how much I had changed. The person I was now was shaped by everything that had happened, in ways I could not fully explain. I was not who I had been before, and I would never return to that version of myself. But I was also not entirely defined by loss alone. There were layers to my experience now: grief, memory, reflection, quiet strength, uncertainty, all existing together. None of them canceled each other out. They simply coexisted, forming something complex and ever-changing. I began to see that continuing did not mean moving away from what had happened. It meant carrying it in a different way. It meant allowing it to be part of my life without letting it take all of it. This understanding was still fragile, still incomplete, but it was there. There were still questions I could not answer, still feelings I could not fully understand. But there was also a growing sense that I did not need to have all the answers. Some things could simply exist as they were, without needing to be resolved. And so I continued, not with certainty, but with a quiet acceptance of what had become my reality. Each day was still shaped by what I had lost, but it was also shaped by something else, a slow, gradual movement toward something I could not yet fully see. I was still carrying the weight, still feeling the absence, still learning how to live within it. But I was also beginning, in small and uncertain ways, to live beyond it, even if I did not yet know what that truly meant. There came a quiet shift within me, so subtle that I almost did not notice it at first. It was not a sudden change, not something that announced itself clearly, but something that slowly unfolded over time. I began to realize that I was no longer only surviving each day. I was beginning, in the smallest ways, to live within them again. This realization did not come with relief or happiness. It came with a kind of stillness, a quiet awareness that something inside me was adjusting. The grief had not disappeared, nor had the absence become any less real. But there was now space, small, fragile spaces where something else could exist alongside it. I started to notice that my thoughts were not always pulled back to the same place. There were moments when I could focus on something in front of me without immediately feeling the weight of everything behind me. These moments were brief, but they were enough to show me that my mind was slowly learning how to move differently. There was also a growing sense of acceptance, not in the sense of agreeing with what had happened, but in the sense of no longer resisting its reality. The constant questioning, the silent searching for reasons, the quiet refusal to believe, it had all softened. Not completely, but enough for me to recognize that this was something I could not change. Acceptance, I realized, is not a single moment. It is not a decision that can be made once and then completed. It is something that unfolds gradually in layers over time. There were still moments when I resisted, when I felt the same disbelief, the same quiet protest within me. But those moments were no longer constant. I began to feel a different kind of connection to my memories. They were still emotional, still deeply meaningful, but they were no longer always overwhelming. I could sit with them in a quieter way, allowing them to exist without being completely overtaken by them. It was not easy, and it did not happen every time, but it was happening. There was also a shift in how I experienced silence. It was still present, still deeply felt, but it no longer always felt unbearable. There were moments when I could sit within it without feeling the need to escape. It had become something familiar, something I understood, even if I did not fully accept it. I started to notice the world around me in a different way, not as something distant or separate, but as something I was slowly re-entering. The details that once felt overwhelming or meaningless began to take shape again. A quiet moment, a simple movement, a passing thought, these things began to feel real again, even if only slightly. There was still a distance between myself and everything else, but it was not as wide as it had once been. I could feel moments of connection, however brief, however fragile. These moments did not erase anything, but they added something new, a sense that I was not entirely lost within my grief. I also began to understand that moving forward did not mean leaving anything behind. This had been one of my deepest fears, that continuing would somehow erase what had been lost, that it would mean letting go in a way I was not ready for. But I started to see that carrying something forward is not the same as holding it in place. What had been lost was not something I could leave behind, nor was it something I needed to. It had become part of me, part of how I saw the world, part of how I experienced everything. Moving forward did not change that. It simply meant allowing life to continue alongside it. There were still difficult days, still moments when everything felt heavy again, when the grief returned with a force that reminded me of how it had once been. But those moments no longer defined everything. They were part of my experience, but not all of it. I began to feel a quiet sense of strength, though it was not the kind I had once imagined. It was not about overcoming or conquering anything. It was about endurance, about continuing even when things were difficult, about allowing myself to feel everything without turning away from it. This strength was not something I chose. It was something that had formed within me, slowly, through everything I had experienced. It was present in the way I faced each day, in the way I allowed myself to continue, even when I did not feel ready. I also noticed that my understanding of life had changed. There was a deeper awareness now, a recognition of how fragile everything is, how quickly things can shift. This awareness did not bring fear as much as it brought a kind of clarity, a quiet understanding of what truly matters. There were moments when I could feel something close to peace, not complete, not lasting, but present. A quiet moment where everything felt still, where the weight was not as heavy, where I could simply exist without being pulled in different directions. These moments were rare, but they were real. I did not know what the future would look like, or how I would continue to change as time went on. There were still uncertainties, still questions without answers. But there was also a growing sense that I would find a way to continue, even if I did not yet know how. I was no longer standing at the beginning of something I could not understand. I had moved through parts of it, experienced its depth, and begun to find my place within it. Not a place of comfort, but a place of understanding. And so I continued, carrying everything I had been through, everything I had lost, and everything I was slowly becoming. Not moving away from the past, but moving forward with it, step by step, into a life that was still unfolding, even in its uncertainty. The passing of time began to reveal subtler patterns in the way I experienced my loss. Grief was no longer a constant, crashing wave. It had become a quieter undercurrent, sometimes gentle, sometimes turbulent, but always present. I started to notice the rhythm of my days, how the heaviness ebbed and flowed, leaving small pockets of space where I could breathe, reflect, or simply exist without being pulled under. There was a curious paradox in this phase. I felt both lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because the intensity of the initial pain had softened, allowing me brief moments of reprieve. Heavier because, with clarity, I began to fully understand the depth of what had been taken from me. The absence was permanent, and the reality of living without what I had once known pressed in on me in new and unexpected ways. I noticed that my mind had started to wander more freely. I could imagine possibilities for my life that were not anchored entirely to the past. These moments were fleeting and sometimes uncomfortable because they reminded me of the uncertainty of the future and the permanence of the loss. Yet, they were also evidence that I was slowly beginning to engage with life again, cautiously, step by step. The world outside my grief was still present, yet it had changed in my perception. Simple scenes, once mundane, now carried quiet significance. A fleeting smile between strangers, the pattern of light through the window, the rhythm of rain on the roof, all of these began to register in ways they had not before. I felt an unusual combination of melancholy and appreciation, as though the world was reminding me that life continued, both fragile and resilient. I also began to recognize the way my inner life had shifted. Thoughts that once were constant and spiraling had started to settle, forming threads of reflection rather than storms of emotion. The silence within me, though still profound, became less oppressive. It was no longer a cavernous void, but a space I could inhabit with awareness, where memories could exist without immediately turning into unbearable sorrow. There were moments when the absence hit with full force, a quiet corner, a phrase remembered, a gesture long gone. In those moments, it felt as though nothing had changed, as though the entire weight of the beginning had returned to me. Yet, even in those moments, I began to notice that I was no longer consumed in the same way. There was a slight distance forming, a buffer that allowed me to feel without being entirely overtaken. I began to understand the subtle ways in which grief reshapes identity. I was no longer entirely the person I had been before the loss. Some parts of myself had been irrevocably altered, more aware of fragility, more attuned to the quiet, more capable of sitting with discomfort without seeking escape. And yet, some pieces remained unchanged, preserved by habit, memory, or instinct. This mix created a complex version of myself, one neither entirely new nor fully familiar. The idea of moving forward continued to challenge me. It was not about leaving anything behind, for I could not and would not. Rather, it was about finding a way to continue carrying the absence without allowing it to define every moment. This was a delicate balance, one I often questioned. Each day required careful negotiation with my own thoughts, an awareness of both vulnerability and resilience. I also noticed a shift in my connection to others. Interactions no longer felt purely automatic or socially necessary. They carried an added layer of reflection. I became more sensitive to emotions, to nuances, to unspoken tensions. Perhaps it was the grief that had sharpened my perception, attuning me to the undercurrents of feeling around me. Or perhaps it was a new awareness of the fragility of connection itself. There were times when hope seemed impossible to imagine, yet hope appeared in the smallest forms, an unanticipated kindness, a memory that brought comfort rather than pain, a moment of quiet in the midst of the noise. These small fragments of possibility were significant, not because they promised a return to happiness, but because they reminded me that life, though altered, was still unfolding. I began to feel a subtle but persistent truth. Living with grief does not mean surrendering to it entirely. It does not mean forgetting or minimizing what has been lost. It means holding it alongside everything else, finding ways to continue existing while honoring what can never be reclaimed. Each day was still a negotiation, a careful dance between sorrow and presence, memory and continuation, loss and adaptation. But within that delicate movement, I started to sense a fragile, quiet resilience. Not a triumph or victory, but a subtle persistence that allowed me to remain, to endure, and to continue engaging with the world in small, meaningful ways. And so I continued, carrying the entirety of what I had been through, the weight of absence, the intensity of memories, and the cautious emergence of possibility. I was still bound by grief, yet not entirely imprisoned by it. Step by step, moment by moment, I was learning to exist within the life that had been irrevocably transformed, navigating the delicate balance between remembering and moving forward. Time had stretched so differently now. It no longer felt linear, predictable, or orderly. Days flowed unevenly, some dragging with heaviness, others slipping past in quiet, almost unnoticed moments. The early chaos of grief, the sharp, unrelenting waves that had once overtaken every thought, had dulled, leaving in its place a more constant, steady presence. It had become a companion of sorts, sometimes gentle, sometimes persistent, but always a part of my existence. I began to notice a deeper kind of endurance forming within me. It was not obvious or dramatic. It was quiet and subtle, built from the countless small acts of getting through a day, of facing what came without running, of allowing myself to experience without judgment. This endurance was not something I had sought or even wanted at first, but it had grown naturally from the necessity of continuing. The memories remained vivid, layered with both tenderness and ache. I could recall moments that once felt overwhelmingly painful, and now they existed alongside other emotions: curiosity, reflection, even a faint sense of gratitude for having experienced them at all. These emotions did not cancel out the loss, nor did they erase the absence. They simply allowed me to hold it differently, with a slightly larger capacity to breathe in its presence. I began to see that the grief itself had changed shape. It was no longer only about what had been taken from me, but also about how that loss had redefined my perspective. The intensity remained, but it was accompanied by a subtle awareness that life could still contain moments of beauty, reflection, or quiet peace, even amid sorrow. This was not consolation. It was understanding. The silence that had once felt oppressive had shifted too. It was no longer a void to escape, but a space where reflection could exist. I learned to sit within it without panic, to allow my thoughts to wander, to acknowledge the weight without being consumed. The silence became a mirror, revealing both my fragility and my quiet resilience. I also began to notice how my sense of self had transformed. The person I had been before the loss and the person I had become since were intertwined now, creating a complex, layered identity. Some parts of me remained untouched by grief, while others had been reshaped entirely. This combination made me cautious, but also acutely aware of the depths I had endured. The world around me felt subtly different as well. I observed small details that had once gone unnoticed: the movement of light across a room, the rhythm of footsteps, the hushed cadence of voices. These fragments reminded me that life continued in ways both ordinary and profound, and that I too was still a part of it, even if only in fragments. There were still days when the grief returned with force, catching me by surprise. A fleeting memory, a subtle reminder, or even a quiet thought could pull me back to the rawness of the past. These moments were intense, but they no longer consumed me entirely. I had learned, in these years of carrying absence, that I could feel deeply and still continue moving forward. I began to understand that moving forward did not mean leaving anything behind. The absence, the memories, the love, the pain, they were not things to abandon. They were not weights to set down entirely. They were part of me, carried within me, shaping how I approached each new day. To move forward was to hold these things while still making space for life to exist alongside them. Hope had returned in small, quiet ways. It was not the kind that promised certainty or resolution. It was a fragile, flickering awareness that some moments might still bring light, that life could still unfold in unexpected ways, that the future, though uncertain, was not entirely closed. This hope was not naive. It was simply a recognition that life, even in its altered form, continued to offer the possibility of connection, reflection, and subtle joy. I saw now that strength is rarely dramatic. It is not loud or obvious. It lives in the quiet persistence of continuing, in the decision to exist fully in each moment, even when it is heavy, even when it is painful. My strength had grown from countless small acts, getting through a day, breathing through sorrow, remembering without being consumed. In this final reflection, I realized that grief is not something that ever truly leaves. It becomes part of the architecture of life, shaping every thought, every choice, every pause. But it does not have to define every moment. It can coexist with presence, awareness, and the slow, fragile reemergence of life. And so I remained, carrying everything I had lost and everything I had survived. Not completely whole, not entirely healed but present. Living with absence, honoring memories, enduring quietly and slowly, gently, finding the threads of life that still wove themselves into my days. In this space, I learned that continuing is not about forgetting. It is about holding, bearing, and embracing what remains, and discovering, in the quietest way, that even amid profound loss, life persists, and so do I.